I used to think pain was something you could recognize, something loud, a slammed door, a raised voice, a night that ended with someone leaving and never coming back. But the pain that shaped me the most didn't look like that. It didn't throw anything. It didn't beg for attention. It waited. It sat in the corner of ordinary days and watched me grow up around it, like dust settling on furniture you don't touch anymore. In my earliest memories, the house is always quiet. Not peaceful, just quiet in the way a place becomes when people have learned not to take up space. The walls ripped in, and the floors were cold even in summer. The cold came from the ground, from the cracked tiles, from the parts of the house we never fixed, because fixing meant admitting something was broken. We lived in a neighborhood where most windows were covered, not for privacy, for shame, for keeping the world out, for keeping the world from seeing in. My mother would wake up before dawn, not because she wanted to, but because her body couldn't relax. Even when she lay down, her mind stayed standing. I remember the sound of her feet in the kitchen, soft and careful, as if the floor might punish her for making noise. She didn't turn on many lights. A single bulb would glow above the sink, dull and tired, like it was doing us a favor. I'd lie in bed and listen, the spoon against the cup, the kettle whispering, the smallest sounds stretched into a whole morning. My father didn't wake up the same way. He woke like someone returning from a far place, confused that the world had continued without him. Sometimes he was already angry before his eyes opened. Sometimes he was quiet in the thick, heavy way that made everyone else quieter too. He wasn't a violent man. Not in the obvious sense. He didn't hit. He didn't scream often. He didn't leave bruises you could point to. His damage was slow. It was in the way he sighed like we were all extra weight. It was in the way he looked through me, not at me. It was in the way he treated conversation like a cost. I learned early not to ask for much, not because I was trained with strict rules, because I could feel, even as a child, that every request was a small risk. If I asked for something, I had to be prepared for what it might awaken. A reminder we couldn't afford it, a look that said, "Do you think life is easy?" A silence that felt like punishment. So I learned to want things quietly. I learned to swallow my wants before they reached my mouth. At school, I was the child who didn't raise a hand, not because I didn't know the answers, because I didn't want eyes on me. I didn't want the teacher to call my name and my classmates to turn, just to see the kind of child who always looked like they were listening for something that wasn't there. I watched other children cry without thinking. A scraped knee, a lost pencil, a harsh word. They would cry and someone would notice. Someone would reach for them. Someone would say, "It's okay." I didn't understand that kind of crying. In my house, crying didn't solve anything. It made people tense. It made my mother's face tighten like she was preparing for a storm. It made my father look away, like emotion was a mess on the floor, and he didn't want it on his shoes. So my pain learned a different way to exist. It didn't cry. It waited. There was a winter when the heater didn't work. We used extra blankets and wore our coats inside. My mother would heat water on the stove and fill bottles so we could hold them against our stomachs at night. The bottle sometimes leaked. The hot water would soak into the blankets and then turn cold, and I'd wake up damp and shivering. I didn't complain. I tried to keep my teeth from chattering too loudly. I remember lying there in the dark listening to my own breath. I remember thinking, even at that age, that I needed to be smaller, quieter, less. As if being less would make the cold less angry at us. On some mornings, the electricity would cut out. We'd eat in half-light. My mother would still pack my lunch in the same paper bag, folding the top down neatly like it mattered. Sometimes there was only bread. Sometimes bread and something thinly spread on it. I learned to eat slowly at school. Not because I was polite, but because I didn't want the food to be gone yet. There's a special kind of panic that comes when you can see the end of something good, even if that good is just a sandwich. I didn't have words for that panic. I just had the feeling. the feeling of time running out, the feeling of my body wanting to hold on to what it had, the feeling of waiting for hunger like you wait for rain. As I grew older, I became good at predicting moods. I could tell what kind of evening it would be by the way my father closed the door. I could tell if my mother was worried by the way she washed dishes. Fast, sharp movements, like she was scrubbing something she couldn't see. I could tell if money was tight by the quiet conversations after dinner when they thought I was asleep. My mother would speak in a low voice, as if numbers were shameful. My father would answer with silence or short sentences. Sometimes he'd say, "We'll manage," and somehow it never sounded like hope. It sounded like surrender. At night, I would lie in bed and stare at the ceiling, tracing cracks in the paint. I would count them the way other children counted stars. There were no stars in my room. There was a streetlight outside that flickered, and sometimes it made shadows on the wall that looked like someone standing still. I'd watch those shadows and feel my heart beat too loudly in my chest. That was another thing I learned. Even your heartbeat can feel like a mistake if you grow up in a place where noise means trouble. In my teenage years, people started expecting things from me. They expected me to be bright, to be ambitious, to talk about the future like it was a room I could step into whenever I wanted. But the future felt like something other people owned. I couldn't picture it without feeling embarrassed, not because I thought I didn't deserve a good life, but because I had no practice imagining anything different. My imagination had been trained to stay realistic, and realistic meant cautious. It meant making plans that didn't require faith. It meant being the kind of person who waits. There were friends at school who invited me to their houses. I went sometimes, but I never stayed too long. Their homes had warmth that felt almost unreal. Their parents laughed. Their kitchens smelled like food that was cooked for pleasure, not survival. I would sit on their couches and smile and nod and try to act normal, but inside I would feel something tighten. Not jealousy exactly, more like grief. Grief for a life I didn't know I was missing until I saw it in someone else's living room. And then I'd go home, and the quiet would wrap around me again. The first time I realized emotional neglect could feel like hunger was when I started working. I was old enough to get small jobs, nothing glamorous, just enough to bring home a little money. I thought the money would change things. I thought if I contributed, the house would feel lighter. But it didn't. The house wasn't heavy because of bills alone. It was heavy because none of us knew how to speak openly. We knew how to function. We knew how to endure. But we didn't know how to reach for each other without feeling foolish. I'd come home tired, and my mother would say, "You ate?" I'd say yes. Sometimes I hadn't. But it felt easier to lie than to invite more worry into her face. My father would glance up from his chair. Sometimes he'd say, "Good." Sometimes he'd say nothing. And I'd go to my room, and the pain would wait there too, patient and familiar. At some point, I stopped expecting comfort, not in a dramatic way, not with a declaration, just in the quiet way you stop expecting a certain season to come when you've lived through too many winters. When I was around 18, my mother had a moment at the table. Nothing huge happened, no argument, no shouting. We were eating something simple, and the radio was low in the background. My father was chewing slowly, his eyes distant like his mind was somewhere else. My mother looked at me and said very softly, "You're growing up." I nodded. She looked down at her hands and kept speaking as if she wasn't sure she was allowed to. "I worry you think we didn't give you enough." She didn't say love. She didn't say warmth. She didn't say childhood. She said enough, like life was something measured in portions. I wanted to tell her that she did give me things, that her small care the lunch bag folded neatly, the hot water bottles, the way she tried to keep the house clean even when she was exhausted. Those things mattered. But the words got stuck. My throat tightened, and all I could manage was, "It's okay." It wasn't okay. But that's what I said. Because even then, my pain didn't cry. It waited. It waited for a safer moment. It waited for a day when saying the truth wouldn't hurt her. It waited for a life that felt less fragile. That night, I lay in bed and stared at the ceiling again. The cracks were still there. I realized I'd been waiting my entire life, waiting for the house to feel warm, waiting for my father to soften, waiting for my mother to rest, waiting for money to stop being a shadow, waiting to feel like I belonged to my own days. I didn't know how to stop. Even my dreams were cautious. I didn't dream of grand things. I dreamed of quiet rooms, of having my own space, of buying food without counting coins, of waking up and not listening for tension. I moved out a few years later. Not because I was angry, not because I was escaping, just because life moved forward and I followed it like someone following a path in fog. My first place was small. A single room that smelt faintly of old paint and someone else's cooking, but it was mine. I remember the first night I slept there, alone. The silence was different. It wasn't loaded. It wasn't waiting for a door to slam. It was just silence. At first, that scared me. I realized I had gotten used to the kind of quiet that comes before something, the kind of quiet that means be careful. This new quiet didn't give me instructions. It didn't warn me. It just existed. And I didn't know what to do with that. I kept my habits. I ate slowly. I saved everything. I apologized too much. If someone spoke sharply, my body would tense like a reflex. If someone didn't reply to a message quickly, I would assume I had done something wrong. I carried my childhood into adulthood like a bag that wasn't heavy enough to complain about, but heavy enough to shape the way I walked. I tried relationships. I tried friendships, but I always felt like I was slightly outside the room, even when I was sitting in it. People would say, "You're so calm." They meant it as a compliment. They didn't know the calm was learned, that it wasn't peace. It was self-control born from a place where emotions were dangerous. I would listen to people talk about their problems with loud honesty. They would cry. They would get angry. They would demand. They would be messy. And I would sit there, nodding, offering comfort, like someone who had been trained to care for others, because caring for yourself felt unfamiliar. Sometimes, after I left those conversations, I would feel something in me ache. Not because I wanted to be dramatic, but because I wanted to be real in the way they were real. I wanted to spill out, to be held, to be witnessed. But my pain didn't know how to do that. It waited. It waited for privacy. It waited until I was alone. It waited until the night was quiet and no one could see me. Then it would rise gently like a tide, not with sobs, with a heaviness in my chest, with a long exhale, with the feeling of sitting on the floor of my small apartment, staring at nothing, and realizing I didn't know what I was missing until I had the space to miss it. There were days I would pass families in a park and feel my throat tighten, not because I hated them, because I could see the small moments hands held, laughter shared, someone kneeling to tie a child's shoelace, and I could feel how hungry I still was for that kind of softness. And then I would go home and I would cook something simple and I would eat and I would wash the dishes and I would prepare for the next day. Because that's what I knew how to do. Live. Endure. Wait. I visited my parents sometimes. My mother aged in a way that made me sad. Not because she became less beautiful. Because she became more tired. Her shoulders bent forward like she had been carrying invisible weight for decades. My father spoke even less. He watched television. He made small comments. He asked practical questions. How's work? Eating well? He didn't ask about feelings. He didn't ask if I was lonely. Sometimes I wanted to ask him why. Why he had been so distant. Why he acted like love was something embarrassing. Why he couldn't just look at me and say, "I'm proud of you," without it sounding like a joke. But I never asked. Not because I didn't have the courage. Because I didn't want to open a door that might not lead anywhere. I learned that some people don't have the language for what they feel. They don't know how to hand it to you. They only know how to carry it alone. One day, my mother and I stood in the kitchen together. She was washing vegetables in a bowl. The light in their kitchen was still dim. Some things never changed. I was drying a plate and she said without looking at me, "Your father, he's not good at you know." She made a small motion with her hands, like she was shaping air. Not good at what? At loving? At speaking? At being human? I waited. She sighed. "He worries," she said. "He just doesn't show it." I wanted to laugh, but it didn't come out. Instead, I said quietly, "I know." But I didn't know. Not really, because worry without warmth still feels like absence. Worry without tenderness still leaves you alone with your thoughts. That night, after I left, I sat in my apartment and thought about how pain can be inherited, not as a dramatic curse, as a set of habits, as a way of moving through life. My parents had their own pain. My mother's was visible in her exhaustion. My father's was hidden behind his silence. And I had learned from both of them. I had learned to hold everything in, to be responsible, to be quiet, to survive. In my late 20s, I started to notice how my body carried those lessons. My shoulders stayed tense even when nothing was happening. My stomach knotted for no reason. I was always bracing, always preparing, as if calm was something temporary, something that could be taken away at any moment. I tried therapy once. I didn't go for long, not because it didn't help, but because it was strange to speak about my life as if it mattered. It was strange to say, I felt lonely, and have someone nod like that loneliness was real. It was strange to be asked, "What did you need as a child?" Because I didn't know. I had never asked myself that question. Needs were things other people had. I had responsibilities. But slowly I started to understand. I needed someone to notice me. Not for my achievements, not for my good behavior, just to notice that I existed. I needed softness without conditions. I needed to be allowed to be sad without feeling guilty. I needed someone to say, "You don't have to be strong right now." And I realized something else too. I had been waiting for those things to come from the people who couldn't give them. I had been waiting like a child, even as an adult, waiting for my father to suddenly become expressive, waiting for my mother to stop being afraid, waiting for my past to rewrite itself. But some pain doesn't get rewritten. It just becomes part of the story. And the only choice is what you do with it. I started small. I bought flowers for my apartment, not because someone gave them to me. Because I wanted color in my space. I cooked meals that took longer than necessary, just to prove to myself I had time. I sat by a window and watched rain without feeling guilty for doing nothing. I let myself rest even when my mind tried to tell me rest was dangerous. Some days I failed. Some days I went back to old habits. I overworked. I avoided people. I kept my feelings tucked away like fragile items. But there were other days. Days when I noticed I was breathing easier. Days when I laughed and didn't immediately feel embarrassed. Days when I spoke honestly in a conversation and didn't apologize for it. The changes weren't dramatic. They were quiet. They were slow, like learning a new language. A language made of gentleness. A language my childhood never taught me. There was a moment not long ago when I was walking home after work. The street was calm. The sky was gray, but not threatening, just soft. I passed a bakery, and the smell of warm bread filled the air. I stopped without thinking. I went inside and bought something small, not because I needed it, because I wanted it. I walked home eating it slowly, tasting it, letting it be a pleasure instead of a calculation. And I realized suddenly that this was what healing looked like for me. Not a grand transformation, not a dramatic moment of forgiveness, just these small decisions. Choosing to feed myself, choosing to pause, choosing to exist without waiting for permission. When I got home, I washed my hands, turned on a lamp, and sat down. The apartment was quiet, and for the first time in a long time, the quiet didn't feel like something holding its breath. It felt like space. I thought about my younger self, the child listening to the spoon against the cup, the teenager watching other families and feeling a strange grief, the young adult leaving home and carrying silence like a shield. I didn't feel anger toward them. I felt tenderness, not the kind of tenderness that fixes the past, but the kind that says you did what you knew how to do. Some pain doesn't cry, it waits. It waits in the way you hesitate before asking for help. It waits in the way you flinch when someone raises their voice. It waits in the way you keep your joys small so they won't attract attention. It waits in the way you keep telling yourself it wasn't that bad because you had food, because you had a roof, because nobody hit you, because you should be grateful. But waiting doesn't mean the pain isn't there. It just means it learned to survive quietly. And maybe that's what I've been learning too. Not how to erase it. Not how to turn it into a victory story. Just how to carry it without letting it own every room I walk into. I still visit my parents. My mother still asks if I've eaten. My father still sits in his chair. Sometimes he nods at me, like that is his version of affection, and I take it, not as a perfect love, but as the love he knows how to offer. I've stopped waiting for them to become people they are not. I've stopped waiting for the past to give me what it didn't give. Instead, I bring my own softness into the present. I bring it into my home. Into the way I speak to myself. Into the way I allow silence to be peaceful. I still have pain. I still carry those quiet winters, those dim kitchens, those unspoken words. But now when the pain comes, it doesn't feel like an enemy. It feels like an old part of me knocking gently at the door. And I don't always know what to say to it. Sometimes I just sit with it. Sometimes I make tea. Sometimes I watch the light change in the room. Sometimes I let myself feel the weight of what I didn't have, without trying to explain it away. Because some pain doesn't cry. It waits, and now when it waits, I don't leave it alone in the dark. I stay. I breathe. I keep living. Quietly. With dignity. With the slow, ordinary courage of someone who is still here, even after years of silence.